Hi, everyone. My name is Marta Zeymo, the Climate Strategy Coordinator for Conservation International, and I'm so excited to be here with you all today. Thanks for joining us on this special Earth Day Instagram Live. We've got a great day of programming ahead of you. So today I'm being joined by Stephanie Kimball, the Director of our Climate Change Strategy here at CI. We're going to be talking about the connections between climate change, COVID-19, and nature. So let's get started. So just added Steph, waiting for her to join. Hi, Steph. How are you?
Good. Hi, Marta. How are you doing?
Doing very well. Happy Earth Day to you.
Happy Earth Day to you as well. Happy 50th.
Yeah, it's a big one. It's a big one. Half a century. But let's get started.
All right.
For those of us who are new to the CI community, can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your work with Conservation International?
Sure. So like Marta said, my name is Stephanie Kimball, and I'm Director of Climate Strategy at CI. So in that role, what I do is I help to align CI's work around the globe on climate change and conservation. So what we do for climate change and conservation is called natural climate solutions. So that's activities such as stopping deforestation caused by expanding commodity agriculture or restoration of degraded land. Deforestation accounts for 11% of greenhouse gas emissions, and so it's particularly important that we address that emission source. And in addition, restoration is the only current technology out there that can remove the amount of emissions we need that are already in the atmosphere at the scale we need. So together, these solutions can contribute over a third of the solution we need to reach our Paris Agreement goals. So we really work around the world in over 30 countries to implement these solutions and also get them incorporated into policies and get them funded at the levels that are needed.
That's awesome. So, I mean, as you just mentioned, science is a key foundational element of everything that we do here in CI, influencing and informing all of the work that we do. So similarly, with this global health crisis, COVID-19, we're seeing a huge scientific response, of course, scientists, doctors, physicians around the world, providing explanations of where this is happening, why, how, etc. So with that, these scientists have been talking about how protecting nature and ending the global wildlife trade is critical to preventing future pandemics. So how is COVID-19 connected to Conservation International's climate strategy?
Great question. So at a basic level, when animal habitats are destroyed via activities such as deforestation, their territories become closer to where humans live. So the more contact between species, the more likely it is that zoonotic diseases can jump between those species. And similarly with the wildlife trade, excuse me, similarly with the wildlife trade, animals that are not usually together are brought together in close proximity, including to humans. And so by addressing wildlife trade as well as keeping ecosystems intact, we have a chance to reduce the chance of such diseases jumping between species in the future. So that's connected to CI's strategy because, like I said, we work on reducing deforestation and restoring these ecosystems so that animals have more space to live where they're supposed to live. So it not only reduces the chances of pandemics, but has the benefit, of course, of all of the climate impacts that we talked about and biodiversity impacts as well.
Wow, that's really impactful. By protecting and stewarding the natural resources around us and our communities, sounds like we can not only reduce the threat of future viruses, but increase our resilience. So with the virus threatening people around the world, their way of living in a way that we've never seen before, climate change also poses a similar threat. So are there any lessons that we can learn for how we're responding to this global health crisis?
Definitely. I think there's a lot of similarities between COVID and climate change, and there's also a few key differences. So in both of those ways, there's lessons to be learned. The first one is that I think there's an issue of early aggressive action that's needed for both issues. So if we wait until the worst impacts are felt from the pandemic, or if the worst impacts are felt from climate change, we don't have a chance to actually act anymore. So what might seem like overly aggressive action in the moment is actually what is preemptively needed because of the lag time of both of these. So as we know with COVID, there's a several week lag time between the worst symptoms and when you've actually acquired the disease. So you extrapolate that out a bit, and with climate change, it can be a few decades. So the scale of time is different, but it has the same impact where people don't have that direct correlation of threat that they need to for how severe the actual problem is. Another comparison I think that's really interesting is the gain in scientific literacy. So we see people talking about these terms like flatten the curve, and the scientists have really been listened to at these policy levels right now, and that urgent action was needed, and it's been taken in a lot of places. So seeing that scientific literacy having traction in decision making and in the general public, and like the individual actions that are needed, I think there are some parallels that we can use in climate to see what was really needed to finally get the scientific decision making to become a reality. Another really important comparison is the need to act together in unison, and that we're not going to get anywhere alone. So it doesn't matter if half of the world addresses coronavirus, the other half will still get it because of all of our globalization. In the same way, we have one atmosphere. So we cannot address climate change in a piecemeal way. We have to work together in a coordinated response. It's not us versus them, it's all of us. And then the other thing would be kind of related to my first point about preparation. So, if we listen to the experts and prepare now, then we can avoid the worst of these problems in the future. We know the timeline for these things. We know what needs to happen. And so if we can take what happened with, the pandemic response has been solid, but we also knew that this was coming. If we had listened to the experts, we could have been even more prepared. Well, I don't want to look back in 10 years and say, how could we have better prepared for climate change? We're seeing what happens with the upheavals of our daily lives when our governments or our institutions are not fully prepared to the extent that our industrialized societies could be to these challenges. So I think we can take from it the need to be aggressive and make sure that we are doing what's needed now while we still have time. One key difference though between the two, I think, is with a pandemic, it's all negative. Like, we're just trying to not have as many people die. There's nothing that we're building toward like we could with the climate crisis opportunity. So while many people are suffering with COVID and many people are suffering with current impacts of climate change, with climate change, it also, a lot of the responses is going to allow us to build a better future, a more just, equitable, healthier, safer future. And so I think, oftentimes climate change actions can sound like sacrifices are being asked. But at the same time, what we're really asking for is to build something better, build something with renewable energy that is more distributed, and that can be realized in a way that doesn't mean that we're living back in the Stone Ages. So I think that is a key difference, is that there is a better future we can build through climate action.
Wow, that's really powerful, Steph. Sounding like that community resilience, that community practice is a key similarity between how we can respond, like you just said. So in order to make ourselves more resilient by all working together, we can do that. But moving from response to back down to people, here at Conservation International, our motto is that people need nature. So by identifying some of the things, how we can respond to this global crisis and the actions we can take, let's dive deeper and look at who is being affected by both this health crisis and climate change. Are there any similarities between the communities that are being impacted and how?
Yeah, that's a great question. So unfortunately, both of these issues are rather regressive in their impacts. So meaning the most vulnerable people are realizing the worst of it. So in a lot of places right now, Indigenous communities are facing a really difficult situation where they have low healthcare access typically, such as in the Amazon. And so if there are groups coming in to deforest their territory, they are passing the disease on to the indigenous populations. At the same time, there's low amounts of enforcement of existing rules and laws against deforestation on these indigenous lands, and so they're having destruction of their land at the same time as getting, given this disease. And so it's a really tough situation for people right now. And CI is working hard with our partners, particularly in the Amazon, to try and address this. Another group is if we look at urban areas, so there's an environmental and climate justice angle to this, where there was a recent study that showed that lower air quality in the place that someone lives is directly correlated to a higher risk of death from COVID. And a lot of low air quality is often related to fossil fuel infrastructure. It's communities that live by refineries. It's communities that live in dense areas that just have a lot of, fuel combustion engines for their cars, coal-fired power plants. All of these things put particulates into the air that are particularly bad on people's lungs and heart. And so that increase in vulnerability because of fossil fuel infrastructure is actually making them more vulnerable to coronavirus. And then we have the global South in general has a lower level of resilience to shocks to the system. So both climate and coronavirus is a massive shock to the system. And what we see is because of economic inequalities, disparities in the social infrastructures that we need, there's less ability to respond to these moments of crisis. So even just an example like clean water, we have everybody out there in the public health community is saying, wash your hands with clean water for 20 seconds with soap. Well, there's literally billions of people in the world that don't have access to that. So if this gets into their communities, the main barrier of defense we have that we're suggesting is not accessible. And so that's related to climate as well, that, some of the main things we need to be resilient and adaptive to the coming climate issues are often not accessible, or they're already weakened infrastructures. So one of the ways that we respond to climate change at CI through the ecosystem-based approaches will make those natural systems more resilient. And like we referenced earlier, it can also help with things like pandemics in the future. And then just in general, climate change and coronavirus are multipliers of threat. So when you have already climate impacts like droughts, wildfires, then you put a pandemic on top of that, or vice versa, you have a particular strain on these vulnerable populations. And as climate change worsens, we're going to just have more of this happening. So I think having this moment be a reset of how do we structure our societies to take care of people in a holistic way is going to be key to, it's not just about emissions, it's about making us resilient as whole societies.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I mean, as everyone's been saying, that COVID-19 doesn't discriminate, but it's true. Like you said, it's definitely impacting certain communities more than others. But I think the one thing that we're seeing is that the work and the actions that we can take individually by staying home, by washing our hands, by wearing masks, we're having an impact on not only protecting and keeping our families safe, but also keeping the communities around us that we're part of safe. And I think that's something that we can take into climate change as well, that individual actions have power, and those behavior changes are powerful. So given all that, we are learning a lot, and we're adding a lot of new terms and vocabulary. So things like social distancing and sheltering at home, these are things that prior to 6 months ago, we would never have used. But another key one is flattening the curve. Is that something we can use for climate change? Can we flatten a curve like we are with COVID?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting comparison in terminology, because what flattening the curve means in the COVID scenario is we're trying to lengthen the time it takes to get to our peak, right? So we're lowering the ultimate number of cases at a time so that we can handle it as a society, so that the healthcare system doesn't get overrun. So in a similar way, through the IPCC 1.5 degree report, we have a carbon budget laid out for us by the scientists. We know that if we burn a certain amount of fossil fuels, we will get over the 1.5 degrees global warming. Mm-hmm. So we know how much carbon we can burn. And now it's a matter of spreading it out as long as we can, hopefully not using even the whole budget, but the chances are we will ultimately need to do that. So we need to do it as slowly as possible so that we can, in the meantime, be building the renewable energy infrastructures we need, be adapting and putting in the resilient infrastructure we need that will help us to handle the coming climate impacts that are already in the pipeline. And so the longer we can take to use up our carbon budget, the better chance we have of our systems being able to handle that transition. So I do think it's a very similar idea that hopefully, now is not the time to be necessarily pushing to align those messages because we have this crisis right now on our hands. But I do think that elevated public understanding of these kinds of global and scale issues can help us when we do come to the time to start talking about climate more directly.
Yeah, that the budget metaphor really works in the sense of trying to spread it out over the course of years, decades. So we really have a timeline set in front of us by these scientists and these experts around the world. So with that in mind, with this timeline, with our plans forward, how is the global response to COVID-19 and all the actions being taken by governments, how is that impacting climate action? And if it is at all, and what does that mean for us going forward?
Yeah, I think this is something that our team has been grappling a lot with because, as I was just mentioning, it's a moment we need to be sensitive to prioritizing health and getting this under control. At the same time, these upheavals, it doesn't mean we're going to go back to normal. There's going to be changes, and we have to be prepared for which direction things go in. So the way that I see it, there's a chance that things could be a lot worse for climate action for a while, but also a chance that this could open up a window for more climate action. So I think that the world is still deciding which route we will go on. And I think, in our position here at CI, we need to be prepared for both, but obviously we want to see it go in the direction of more climate action. So I can just break down a little bit why I see those two pathways as options here. So let's take the negative first, the pessimistic view, so we can end on a good note. Basically, governments are going to be so focused on economic recovery right now and understandably healthcare. And oftentimes when those moments of crisis come, we fall back on business as usual decisions and who's already in power and further empowering them. So we've seen this already with some bailouts being suggested by, the people like fossil fuel companies that might not necessarily need it right now, but there's a narrative around stability and returning to normalcy that oftentimes trends us toward business as usual decisions. There's also increased exploitation of natural resources happening. So, from the natural climate solutions space, when we need to stop deforestation, if people are looking to, improve their economic situation and governments are looking to support that, they may start to open up areas that were formerly under protection to exploit those forests or those minerals, because that's what maybe that country has as their main currency of ability to recover. And so we're pretty concerned about that. We've already seen some anecdotal evidence from our programs in tropical forest countries that there's been an uptick in illegal deforestation since the coronavirus lockdowns have happened, because the enforcement agencies are not sending people out to enforce these things. So we are a bit concerned that there might be some taking advantage of that situation, and it could set us back quite a ways in the progress we have been making.
Yeah.
So if there's a suppressed appetite for ambitious climate action and lower amounts of funding that are available because it's all going toward pure economic recovery in a business as usual way, we're going to have to rethink how we achieve our climate solutions and perhaps nest them under other things, or they take a back seat, or maybe we play defense more and we just have to try and not get things rolled back too far. Yeah. Another example from the US is the rollback of some of the pollution regulations that have just happened. So, you know, the emission standards for cars and some of the mercury and other emissions from coal plants that are being relaxed in this moment. So, you know, there's a lot of defense that might have to be played, and it might not be as aggressive as we were hoping to be in this year 2020. So those are some concerns I have. But on the other side, there's some positive options here. There's a growing amount of money by governments being spent in this moment, and that means there's an opportunity to shape where that money is going. Yeah. So if we can make those business as usual decisions not happen, and instead make sure this money is going toward economic recovery in a green direction, so we're not entrenching fossil fuel interests, but instead are entrenching, you know, getting people back to work with weatherization and solar installations and things like that. There's a huge opportunity here for a global Green New Deal to be a part of this economic recovery. And encouragingly, a lot of European ministers have been indicating just that they intend to make these investments in line with biodiversity and climate change goals. And in fact, European business leaders are also saying the same thing. There's a lot of pressure from investors and from governments to make sure that people and institutions who have made climate commitments are not using this moment to roll those back, but to keep that promise to the society. Yeah. So I think, you know, ultimately it means we could build it back better than before. Where there's going to be a building process, but we could make this better. Yeah. And then just a note on the emission reductions. I think people have been hearing that this shutdown has led to lower greenhouse gas emissions, and maybe that's a good thing, as people are saying. But ultimately, you know, it's not going to be a huge amount of reduction. I think the projection right now is 1 to 2% different than last year, which is very tiny. And behind it is no structural change. It's purely, you know, this is an external thing to building something like a new system. So we anticipate that the use of fossil fuels will just rise again right after the pandemic is over. And so we don't want to get into that conversation about, is this being a good thing for climate change? Because what we ultimately want is for economic development to not be related to emissions. And the technology is there to do that. So we just need to, you know, not make people think again that this is what life will be like if we address climate change. We don't have to just stay at home and do nothing to fight climate change. This is not compatible with the future we want to build.
Yeah, I mean, the wording around building that future together in terms of what we can do on climate change, that proactive actions we can take as opposed to the reactions we have to do for COVID, I think are really powerful in terms of building that future that we want to see. There are so many of those pathways and timelines in front of us, positive and negative, and it seems it's up to us now to make those choices. So thereby, we as practitioners, you know, we had our paths set in front of us, what we were doing, and we had our own business as usual as climate change practitioners. Is the global response to this, has that changed what we have to do as climate change strategists, as people working in the field? What does that mean for us as practitioners? It's changing all of our lives. So how's it affecting us?
Yeah, I think, you know, the way that CI works is we rely on engaging local communities, engaging businesses, engaging governments. They're all a bit preoccupied right now. So we aren't able to engage in the same way. You know, it's not safe for us to go into a lot of the communities we're working in, and probably for quite a while. And so at CI, we're holding a lot of remote workshops where available or where that's an option. We're engaging at a more bilateral level with governments instead of at these large international convenings. And we're still trying to push forward what we need to achieve. But just kind of using different means to do so. So, I mean, grateful to have internet to help us with some of that, but it's still not the same, you know? So I think it has caused us to step back and reassess how we will go about making the changes needed from our perspective. In the midterm, you know, as recovery happens, we'll just need to be relying even more on building local capacities to deal with climate change. So, you know, we at CI, we have people from these countries that work in these countries at CI. So just continuing to expand the in-country capacities is going to be really critical as international travel is reduced. On a personal note, as far as it's affected how I address things or approach things, you know, I grapple with big global crises on a daily basis for my job, but even still, it's been quite a shock to the system for how quickly things can change. And you know, a bit disheartening to see how certain actors can use a moment of crisis for their own benefit. But at the same time, it's also been inspiring to see people come together and makes me hopeful for how we can transition that experience to the climate moment.
Yeah, hope is such a powerful tool, and I know something that, you know, reverberates around Conservation International and all the work that we do, that there's hope everywhere. And I think throughout this entire conversation, you know, talking about the partnerships that we have and that we work within, and it's up to us as a global community to do the things that we need to do to protect one another and safeguard one another for each other. So your point about hope, I think, is really well taken and resonates. So where have you been finding your hope? Where else can we look for it in times of these global pandemics?
Yeah, I think that's so critical right now. As we're all separated, it can be challenging to feel hope, because I think a lot of hope comes from collectivity and solidarity. And so, I think what this ultimately is to me is it's a moment of change that's been forced on us. And it's been painful and heart-wrenching and will continue to be so. But it also does open a window for a deep systemic or reorientation of what matters to us. What do we want in our life? What do we want our future to look like? What do we want for each other? And you know, that comes to light when we're shocked out of our regular routines and our regular assumptions about how life is. And so I think that's a moment of hope that the writer Rebecca Solnit has really fleshed out in her writings of late, and particularly in her book called A Paradise Built in Hell, which I would really encourage people to read. What it shows is that disasters over time have created openings that bring us together, unite us around fighting for each other, and to create the world we want. And that unity gives us a chance to bring our collective power together, push aside entrenched interests, and really break through to build the future we want. And I think that this is an opportunity just like that. You know, I think we have to build hope. I think we have to not only address the problem as it is right now, but also be thinking about how through addressing it, we can build something better. So that's what brings me hope. And I hope that other people can find hope in this moment as well, even though it's a tough time. We're all thinking about everyone through this struggle. And so yeah, thank you for the time to talk about this today, Marta.
Yeah, no, thank you for joining, Steph, and thanks for everybody online for joining us as well and chatting about the relationship between these two and how we can learn from climate change and still find hope in these times of uncertainty and find the communities virtually, remotely, and strengthen those bonds around the world. So yeah, thanks again for everybody. Please continue sending us your questions via Instagram. Don't forget to tune in to the next Conservation International's next session for Earth Day Live, which is going to be happening at 1 p.m. So yeah, great. Have a wonderful Earth Day, everybody. Happy 50th. Happy 50th to you, Steph. Stay hopeful.
You too. Thanks, everybody.